A very warm welcome to all participants, and thank you so much for joining us for today's webinar, which is called Protecting Fundamental Values in the European Higher Education Area. My name is Monica. I am Deputy Secretary General of the European University Association in Brussels, and I will be moderating the session for you today. Let me quickly share my screen and my slides with you. This will only take a couple of seconds, hopefully. Great, fantastic. So this is the fifth in a 7-webinar series called Towards Tirana 2024, the Bologna Process and Developments in the EHEA. And this series aims to raise awareness and have a conversation about the Bologna process in its various facets and forms, and from the perspective of those who are affected by it at higher education institutions specifically. Previous webinars have been about mobility, recognition, student-centered learning, and quality assurance. So quite diverse set of topics. You will find recordings of these and other relevant resources on the CVent, the webinar tools welcome page. And just to forewarn you, the next webinar will be about the social dimension of the Bologna process, and this will take place on the 14th of May. Here, just some very basic housekeeping rules. Please be aware that the webinar is being recorded. We invite you to contribute to the conversation in 3 different ways. You can use the chat to convey greetings, to say hi, or to signal technical issues. Second, you can use the Q&A function to ask our speakers questions. And 3, when prompted on your screen, you can respond to a poll that will be popping up on your screen. And now it's a pleasure for me to introduce the speakers that we will hear from today. First of all, I would like to introduce Svein Hulstein, who is a policy officer at DG Education and Culture at the European Commission and a member of the Bologna Working Group on Fundamental Values. Svein is a seconded national expert from Norway. And in Norway, he also worked at the University of Oslo and at the Norwegian Ministry of Education and Research. Thank you so much for being here with us today, Svein. Second, we have Liviu Matei, who's head of the School of Education, Communication and Society at King's College London. Previously, he was provost at the Central European University in Budapest, where he witnessed firsthand some of the pressures that fundamental values are exposed to. Welcome, Liviu. Tomasz Pietrzykowski is our third speaker, and he is Vice Rector of the University of Silesia in Katowice. Thomas is a scholar in the philosophy of law, and he has worked on the concept of values and the relationship between values and laws. So I believe he will add a very relevant academic perspective to our discussion today. Thank you so much for joining us, Tomasz. So now let me just take a few minutes to introduce the topic to you today. I would like to describe the work that has been done in the context of the Bologna process on fundamental values. So just as a quick, very general background, discussions on fundamental values really re-intensified a few years ago. And a widespread consensus emerged that after a long period of relative stability, values like academic freedom or institutional autonomy were actually once again, sadly, on a downward trajectory. And two cases are often cited as early examples of this negative trend. First, in Turkey, where university communities experienced reprisals after an attempted coup in 2016. And second, I've mentioned this institution before, the Central European University, which was forced by the Hungarian government to abandon its base in Budapest and relocate to Vienna. The Bologna process was quite quick to pick up on these issues, and the political basis for protecting and promoting fundamental values was formulated in the communiques that were adopted by the Bologna ministers in Paris in 2018 and in Rome in 2020. The Paris communique stated that fundamental values, and here I quote, form the backbone of the European higher education area. Having seen these fundamental values challenged in recent years in some of our countries, we strongly commit to promoting and protecting them in the entire EHEA through intensified political dialogue and cooperation. End of quote. And this commitment was then reaffirmed in the Rome communique in 2020. Strength of the ministerial communiques, in my opinion, was that from the beginning, they clearly formulated the elements making up fundamental values, which of course can be quite a wide-ranging and even fuzzy term. And the elements making up fundamental values as defined by the Bologna ministers are academic freedom, academic integrity, institutional autonomy, student and staff participation in higher education governance, and the public responsibility for and of higher education. And at this point, I would like to stress that the Bologna process does not claim to have found the ultimate or an exclusive definition of fundamental values. And I believe there is complete awareness that the concept may contain additional elements such as sustainability, diversity, or others. The elements that were chosen were seen to be particularly relevant given the context of the EHEA and also the history of the Bologna process itself. And now I'm sharing with you a final slide on how the political commitment has been taken further in practical terms until now. A Bologna task force on fundamental values operated from 2018 until 2020, and this turned into a working group, which was active from 2020 until 2024. These groups consist mainly of delegates from national authorities and of sector representatives. The working group has developed detailed definitions or conceptualizations, you might say, of the 5 fundamental values. And the aim of this was to create a common understanding on which future steps to promote and protect these values could then be based. And these definitions or conceptualizations will hopefully be endorsed by the Bologna ministers during the ministerial conference in Tirana in May. An initial data collection to capture the state of fundamental values across the EHEA has also been undertaken in preparation for the ministerial conference. And at the same time, a more comprehensive framework for monitoring fundamental values during the next cycle of the Bologna process, so after May 2024, has been developed. And one of the chief architects of this framework, Liviu Matei, is with us today. If you would want to provide any further information on this work, you are, of course, more than welcome to do so. So here is the Bologna work on values in a nutshell. 1, fundamental values have been defined. And 2, their respect or compliance is being monitored or will be monitored more comprehensively in the near future. An important step for the next Bologna cycle from my perspective as a representative of EUA and of higher education institutions in Europe would be the need to develop concrete and positive actions to encourage and promote the respective values, also and perhaps particularly at the level of institutions. And at this point, what I would like to do is kick off the conversation with my guests today. So my first question that I would like to use to kick off this discussion is intended for Svein. Svein, the work carried out in the context of the Bologna process that I've just presented very briefly, of course, has been very significant, but it's not the only policy-driven initiative to deal with fundamental values in a higher education and research context. Several are also ongoing at the EU level. Could you explain the approach that is being taken by DG Education and Culture at the European Commission in its work towards guiding principles on protecting fundamental academic values? Could you tell us a bit about what the principles are meant to be and how they are being developed at the moment?
Well, first I would like to stress that the upcoming framework to promote and protect fundamental values under the Bologna process is an important step forward. We will have a joint understanding of what these values are and eventually also a monitoring mechanism. In the EU, education is in fact the competency of the member states. However, the Charter of Fundamental Rights of the European Union includes the freedom of arts and sciences, which also specifies that academic freedom shall be respected. Academic freedom is a fundamental element of democratic societies and for supporting the quality of learning, teaching, and research. The topic is therefore high on the EU agenda, not least due to the fact that we see that the fundamental academic values are under pressure, also in the EU. This calls for concern. Protecting and promoting academic freedom is central to achieving a European research area as well. It is a fundamental premise for fostering a research ecosystem within Europe, without which it is not possible to train researchers and much less to attract the best scientific minds to the EU. In the context of EHEA, DG RTD is working specifically on the freedom of scientific research in line with the Bonn Declaration. This definition also falls more clearly under the EU's shared competency for research. The political support from the European Parliament is also important, not least through the establishment of the Forum for Academic Freedom. In a European Parliament resolution of 17 January this year, the Parliament also requests the Commission to put forward a proposal for a legislative act on the freedom of scientific research. The European Strategy for University, which is part of a transformative agenda for the higher education sector in Europe, has an emphasis on promoting and protecting European democratic values. In this context, we aim to propose guiding principles on protecting fundamental academic values. This is in fact work in progress, it is not finalized. This work will be based on the Bologna process and the definitions of the 6 fundamental academic values. The planned guiding principles will not be duplicating Bologna or other processes. The rationale behind the initiative is that the EU, as a full member of the Bologna process, should actively follow up and help implementing the EHEA framework within the EU. Furthermore, deep transnational cooperation in the EU, such as within the European Universities Alliances, enhances the need to ensure the same level of protection across the EU. Therefore, there is good reason for the EU to engage in this field. As for the guiding principles, we have initiated a study that aims to suggest ways on how the member states, the EU, and not least the institutions themselves can introduce measures and tools to safeguard the values of Bologna. In the context of the ongoing study, there have already been consultation and interviews to get input from the sector and stakeholders. We need input on the most pressing challenges and possible recommendations on how we best can meet these. Following these consultations, even if academic freedom, institutional autonomy, and integrity will be particularly central, a clear message is that the 6 fundamental values that was presented just now need to be respected as a coherent whole. In our work, we are closely aligned with the European research area as well. This far, DG RTD has had a focus on research security and foreign interference, and they are now working to follow up on a possible legislative act to protect the freedom of scientific research, as requested by the Parliament. This action may potentially benefit the other processes and the safeguarding of academic freedom. What I'm trying to say is there's a great deal of synergy between the different initiatives and processes on the European level that I think altogether will strengthen the safeguarding of the fundamental values.
Thanks a lot, Sven. I think it's great to hear, one, that policymakers really are picking up on this issue in many different fora. I think that's very, very good news. And I also really think it's good to hear that DG EHEA, for example, is really trying to create synergies around this topic. And also that stakeholders are being consulted and being asked for their opinion, because of course this is something that is very much done in favor and for the benefit of stakeholders. I'm thinking of universities in the first instance, but of course we could also think of students, the student population, for example. So thank you very much. Moving on then to Tomasz, I would like to shift perspective slightly from a policy to a more institutional level. Tomasz, could you please describe what fundamental values, what that concept actually means to a university, to your university, and also to its communities, so to academics, to the leadership of the institution, and to the student community? How would you define the concept yourself?
Good afternoon. First of all, thanks a lot for inviting me and for your interest in the perspective of the country in which universities have had to struggle to defend academic values such as institutional independence or freedom of thought, practically for the most of the time of their existence, almost whole of the 20th century for sure. And then in addition, the stormy changes in the recent decades, in particular last years as well. As I'm a lawyer, please let me emphasize the legal dimension first. From that perspective, the fundamental values take form of the most general norms, usually solemnly proclaimed in the charters or bylaws of institutions like universities. And while they become a part of the law in force, then they may and should actually serve as a kind of a constant reference point, a kind of a benchmark for not only drafting more detailed internal rules crucial for all daily operations of an institution, but above all for actual decision making, shaping the actual practices of the university. And the fact that values are usually articulated as rather general and vague principles doesn't by any means make them less binding or pivotal. On the contrary, I would say it is exactly thanks to that they remain capable for guiding and evaluating the integrity of such a diverse range of activities that modern universities embrace, and somehow frame all that diverse range of activities into a more or less coherent whole, giving it a kind of a common denominator, axiological denominator. But what seems to me even more important than that purely legal point of view is the awareness that cultivating and transmitting a spirit of free, rational discussion among equals, which for me is the core, let's say, of that ideal that we want to achieve by protecting and promoting basic academic freedoms. That spirit is the foundation of not only academic community, but the democratic open society as such, at large. Therefore, preserving and making that spirit, so to say, seamlessly internalized in course of academic education, or I should rather say, on occasion of spending one's formative years at the university, it should be conceived as a substantial part of our mission and one of primary goods that we can contribute to society. I would dare say that over time, this role may become even more important than pure accumulation and sharing of specialized knowledge itself, which universities, that latter role, the universities more and more share with many other institutions and centers of excellence. But this area of cultivating, spreading, and somehow instilling that spirit that flows from academic values, probably this is the unique place where the younger generation can get in touch with. So to me, it is both, let's say, the hard legal foundation of the all internal documents and practices of the institution, and something much less palpable, a kind of a spirit that we should spread and cultivate and transmit from generation to generation, and regard it as a considerable or even primary part of our mission as universities. Thank you.
Thank you, Tomasz. I think that's a very interesting point of view, and I think I was confirmed in my belief that you would add a very interesting academic perspective also to this topic. I think what you say about the sort of operationalization, if you will, of values and kind of turning the concept into practices and processes is very important, and we will actually try to get back to this also at a later stage. And also you're highlighting the role of values in and for democratic societies. I think that's a really key point. So now I would like to turn to Liviu and ask you. Obviously, during your time at CEU, you and CEU as an institution were exposed to some quite egregious disregard and disrespect for academic freedom and autonomy from the government in Hungary. And of course, as I'm sure everyone is aware, CEU was even forced to relocate to a different country because of these violations. And now you work in the UK, which is a country with I hope, a much more positive track record. And so I was wondering, could you maybe explain to us what challenges to fundamental values can look like from where you are now, where maybe the challenges aren't quite as obvious and egregious, but I'm sure they still exist?
Well, thank you very much, Monica. And I will also like to start by thanking you and EUA for all your work for the cause of the fundamental values of higher education. And you have done a lot of work over the years, and it is not only the autonomy scorecard to which you made a huge contribution yourself, but everything that you explained in the introduction. Now to your question, I think the current situation in the UK, and maybe I should be more specific because very often, England is different than Scotland and the other nations when it comes to higher education in the UK. But overall, the situation is quite informative for a discussion about what fundamental values are and how they work. And I'm talking in particular about the fundamental values of higher education in the European higher education area. And I'll come back to this, but just to say, there is quite a lot of discussion about what we call here fundamental values of higher education in England, but they are not presented as fundamental values of higher education, and not all are discussed. The public discussion involving politicians, the media, and universities themselves, the public also, is very much about academic freedom and freedom of speech. And that is because this is an issue that is very much on the political and public agenda. And the other values are a lot less often discussed. There is some discussion about university autonomy, and we would not be surprised to hear about that, but not, I haven't heard anything about participation of staff and students in governance, for example, or public responsibility for and of higher education. So the fact that we have a kind of an official list of values in the EHEA, and this is an amazing development as a matter of fact, and positive development, doesn't translate in those values being even mentioned, let alone implemented or lived as such in all systems that constitute the European higher education area. And there are different approaches to this. For example, at my university, King's College, we had an entire series of public debates about the need for reimagining academic freedom as we framed it. But this was quite a lot about fundamental values, and in particular about the fact that academic freedom and freedom of speech are not one and the same. And while freedom of speech is an important concept and principle, it is something that applies to all citizens. And what is important in the university is rather academic freedom, and it is important not to confuse the two. So there was an attempt to kind of change the agenda and the public discussion in this regard, and this was a university initiative. And the sky of this entire debate is dominated by the law adopted last year in the UK, Higher Education parenthesis freedom of speech, which puts forward conceptual reference for academic freedom, which is not exactly the same with the statement on academic freedom, which was adopted in Rome and to which the UK signed off, or which the UK signed off as well. So there are different layers of conceptualization, codification, and practice of academic freedom and the other fundamental values. And Thomas referred to those from an institutional perspective very eloquently. Maybe I just to round up this intervention of mine. I think what is remarkable about these developments in the European higher education area with regard to the fundamental values is several things. One is that we have the list, we have the statements, 5 of which are supposed to be adopted in Tirana, which create a very important conceptual reference nominally for all of us in the European higher education area. And this is unprecedented. This is new and this is important. You will remember in the case of Central European University when the European Commission sued Hungary at the European Court of Justice for infringement of academic freedom. Hungary retorted saying, "You are suing us based on what? There is no common European reference for academic freedom. There is no legislation for academic freedom. Now we have something." But this is not the way the European higher education area works. Of course, this is not law. It is not legislation. It is a different type of reference. And the very last comment, I think what is also remarkable about this discussion about values is the degree of clarity that has been achieved. Maybe surprisingly, because traditionally we talk about values, academic values, fundamental values. So what are all these? We talk about values in anthropology, we talk about values in philosophy. I think these values, the ones that you mentioned at the beginning, are kind of organizational values. They have not emerged spontaneously in the history of a tribe or a nation or a population. They are values that are explicitly defined within the context of the European higher education area, which behaves for this purpose similarly to some extent to an organization. And that is why the EHEA can generate such values, and that is why the European Union also can generate such values and norms and so on, while other regions of the world cannot, because they don't have the organizational infrastructure behind.
Thank you, Liviu. I think what you say about framing the issue and, for instance, this strong focus on freedom of speech, which can be found in the UK, but actually freedom of speech and academic freedom not being quite the same thing, I think that's really important. And I think the reason for that is, or rather the reason why the work in the Bologna context, like you say, is so valuable is because it creates this common understanding that can be applied and used in so many different countries across the European higher education area, of course. Turning back to Tomasz now, Tomasz, sorry. What I would like to do is to get as kind of concrete and tangible as possible. And I was wondering whether it might be possible for you to describe an experience that you've had of what I would call a values crisis, if you like, either at your own institution or in your national context, to do with institutional autonomy, academic integrity, any value that you can think of. So could you describe what exactly happened and how the situation was resolved? Are there any specific processes in place to deal with such situations, and who are the actors who get involved? Might you be able to comment on that?
Yes, I think that the Polish example is not so obvious as the Hungarian one, but nonetheless, the political reality in recent years, namely a relatively strong ideological agenda of the previous right-wing government in Poland, put the universities here in the country under some extraordinary, I would say, pressures. And they were mainly related to promoting or suppressing views according to the political expectations of the ruling political camp. And in case of my university, to be as concrete as possible, the government representatives, including two successive ministers of science in Poland, publicly expressed loud and clear their anger caused by our internal disciplinary proceedings carried out against one sociology professor. The situation was that students of that professor had filed a formal complaint against her for imposing what they conceived as religiously inspired conservative ideological views on them during classes. And such complaint was just gave rise to a standard disciplinary investigation launched by appropriate academic officer, by the way, a reputable and experienced legal scholar, whose position was entirely independent of the university authorities, obviously, similarly as the position of the disciplinary board itself. And the government started to criticize and press us, let's say, to withdraw from that disciplinary action what was not allowed, let's say, for the rector or the authorities because of the internal independence of all those bodies that are responsible for disciplinary actions. But admittedly, the government did not take any of direct action against us beyond that public criticism. What they did instead was changing the law on higher education in Poland, adding there a rule excluding presenting religious, ideological, or philosophical views from the scope of disciplinary liability of university professors, in order to, let's say, block the disciplinary action that was underway at our university. And the government actually argued that what they did was actually defending freedom of speech against biases that exist among the academics against, let's say, the conservative right-wing agenda. So I think that this example somehow support and confirms what Liviu suggested, that common understanding of what we mean by such vague concepts like freedom of speech and academic freedom and integrity and so on and so on is of an utmost importance, I would say. And the real hypocrisy of that defense of the freedom of speech from the side of our previous government was quite soon uncovered when, not much later, the same officials started to viciously attack some Warsaw historians for their views on the Polish wartime collaboration with the German occupiers in persecuting Jews. So the government publicly called that research outrageous, defaming, anti-Polish, and they started to threaten that research like that can cause cutting down funding for the institute where it was affiliated. But the Polish academia more or less unanimously protested against this kind of blackmail, and the government finally backed off. But the feeling that there is a risk, or there is a financial carrot and stick method available for the government, and even used from time to time to punish or reward academic institutions depending on the content of the research and outcomes of the research that they carry out, became, let's say, somehow widespread and exerting some kind of preventing or censoring effect. In addition to that, some extraordinary quick career opportunities or personal benefits were offered to those individual professors who agreed to publicly praise the ruling party policies, in particular in the domains in which such policies most blatantly violated democratic and liberal values. So we had a kind of a monetary temptations and threats, I would say, rather than the direct coercion or methods of let's say, brute intervention into the operation of inside operation of the institutions. It was largely unsuccessful, but the prevailing opinion in Poland was that if the government won the third term in office, what they didn't, then the university could become the much more central target of their efforts, and probably much more radical measures would have been taken against, let's say, academic values. And probably this kind of resistance that was quite strong, I would say, in Poland during the last years, modeled after the resistance of the judiciary, which was extraordinary. As a lawyer, I can say more about that if it would be of interest. But certainly the legal community, in particular judges, almost unanimously resisted, let's say, the attempts to subordinate them under the political wishes of the party, and the academic community, let's say, followed that footsteps to some extent. But it was thanks to the fact that the final elections came at the last possible moment, I would say, to let us survive that without much damage, I would say, done to the real level of the academic values protection. Thank you.
Thank you, Tomasz. That's fascinating, and once again, it shows the value of common definitions, but maybe also the way in which concepts can be misrepresented and misused in these discussions. And then finally, as you pointed out yourself, the way that threats or pressures can be quite insidious and not necessarily very clear, as they have been in some countries in Europe. So that's really, really interesting. Thank you. At this stage, what I wanted to do is just launch a quick audience poll to see whether people are still with us. So here's a very simple question, just asking basically how high on the agenda discussions on values feature. So there are three options. It's a hot topic and debated often. B, there is some interest, and C, this is not being discussed at all. So if our participants could just have a quick click, that would be great. and we'll give you a few seconds to find those buttons. Interesting. Okay. So it is definitely being discussed. I think few countries, it seems, have been spared the values discussions in recent years, but it's not always top of the agenda. So there are other issues that are taking up more space in public discussions. That's very interesting. I mean, maybe I would actually like to know what those are. Possibly funding. I think that is always a very, very, very topical issue. But thank you very much for that quick impression. And now I would like to veer back to Svein, because we've now heard two institutional or national perspectives on fundamental values. And we've listened to how exactly these are sometimes challenged or undermined. And now I would like to ask Svein whether he could reflect on how he thinks policy initiatives can help institutions to address values problems. So taking the guiding principles that are being developed by DG EHEA as an example, what would you hope to have achieved through them and with them in practical terms, say 5 years from now?
Well, the many ongoing processes and the not least important framework now being put in place by the Bologna Process will together contribute to putting fundamental values high on the agenda and create awareness on all levels. Actions on the EU level also send an important political message that we need to make the EU Charter of Fundamental Rights a reality when it comes to academic freedom. What is particularly important with Bologna is that we will have a common European understanding of what fundamental values actually entail. Yes, there will still be gray zones, but we will be in a better position to discuss these and to move ahead. Also, the planned monitoring in the EHEA will make breaches more visible, also for political authorities. Hopefully, a more holistic monitoring will foster debate and measures on the national level to better safeguard these values. Monitoring and increased awareness, both within and outside academia, will hopefully make it more difficult to violate fundamental academic values in the future. With the guiding principles, we will not be aiming for new definitions or a separate monitoring. We hope to propose practical guidance and to give institutions and member states some concrete suggestions on how they can actively incorporate measures to promote the respect of fundamental values to fulfill the upcoming Tirana commitments and the EU Charter. But in a longer perspective, again, increased awareness is, in my opinion, key. Not least, we have to make society at large aware of what fundamental academic values are all about and what is actually at stake. This has to do with protecting our democracy and trust in science. When academic freedom is under attack, democracy as such is actually under attack. That would happen, yeah.
Yes, I would agree with everything you've said. I think this call for awareness is incredibly important, and awareness not just within universities or kind of research, higher education communities, but within larger society. I think that is really somewhere where a lot of work needs to be done. Because society needs academic freedom, for example. It relies on it to thrive. So I think that's a really important point. And also what you said in the beginning, this kind of message to make laws and statements and rules and definitions to make them a reality. I mean, this is what I mean. It's great to have them, but how do we make sure that they stick? How do we make sure people understand them? And how do we make sure universities live by them, essentially? Thank you. That was very, very, very instructive. I would send the same question or a similar one to Liviu now. So do you think policy initiatives are a useful way of addressing challenges in terms of values? So from a more institutional perspective, could there be any other, perhaps complementary means to protect and strengthen values? And if so, who do you think needs to do this work? Is it the university leadership? Is it someone else? Liviu, take it away, please.
Yes, well, this is a very important question and in a way difficult to answer. But I will note first that we have witnessed a lot of challenges recently, challenges to academic freedom and to other values. And there is, a lot of evidence to prove that. Take Academic Freedom Index, for example, which indicates that there is a decrease regarding the respect of academic freedom in the world and in Europe. At the same time, I will say, and you mentioned that as well, Monica, there have been a lot of efforts recently to protect and promote fundamental values, policy initiatives at various levels. I think it is important to acknowledge that there are very good and promising developments, including what we are talking about mostly here, the fundamental values of the European higher education area. But when it comes to how effective, efficient, useful are all these developments, we should note that there is a lot of synergy, but also sometimes contradictions and overlapping. There are what I would call frameworks of reference for the fundamental values of higher education developed at the institutional level. One institution saying this is what we understand by university autonomy, and this is how we are going to go about it in our own university. And that's perfectly legitimate and necessary, as a matter of fact. But then we have national framework. So, if we are in the UK, I can make my own policy inside the university, but I cannot ignore the law which says that, if freedom of speech as defined in the law is not respected, then I will have to pay a fine. And then in Europe, at least we live in the European higher education area, there are these European values. But there are, what is interesting is that in Europe, we have not one, but several regional kind of efforts to promote the cause of the fundamental values of higher education. And we discussed the European Parliament because they can adopt legislation. They want to adopt legislation. There are monitoring efforts, and there are even global frameworks of reference. There's a UNESCO recommendation, 2 recommendations: the status of university personnel, freedom of research and responsibility of researchers, Magna Carta. So it looks a little bit, where do I go actually if I am a university leader or an academic or a student or a staff member? What are those fundamental values that are really helping? And I think here there's also a very important question to address: helping what? What is this all about? And it was repeatedly mentioned here, and correctly so, this is about democratic functioning of higher education and of the society. But we should not forget that this entire discussion is actually about knowledge, production, transmission, dissemination, and use of knowledge. That is why we need academic freedom, because it is a precondition for the production of knowledge. That is why we need integrity, because it is not enough to have freedom. It is important to have standards and so on. So that is why these fundamental values are so crucial for us. But to go back to your question and conclude, we have this diversity of frameworks, and it's not easy always to navigate. But I think what is important is for each institution to have a reasonable degree of clarity on all this. And this can be done by generating their own conceptual references, or by making reference to something that exists already. We, as a university, we adopt the principles of freedom of speech on campus of the University of Chicago. That would have helped greatly Stanford with their recent difficulties, for example. Or we can say it's this, the Rome statement. But it is important to have clarity inside the institution, because that will make explicit the commitment to that institution. What are they committed to as individual members, as constituency, students, academics, staff, and also as an entire university community. And there should be guidelines for putting all this in practice. So it's not enough to have the law. It's not enough to have the European global standards. It is important to have mechanisms of translation inside the institution. And yes, this is the primary responsibility of the university leadership, to make sure that is there and works.
Clear words. Thank you, Liviu. And can I also say I very much your call to kind of go back to basics, I suppose, very much resonates with me. So we need academic values like academic freedom, etc., to really enable universities to do their jobs. This is what it's about. We need them because we need to do research. Universities need to do research to advance society. They need to educate a young generation of Europeans, of democratic Europeans. So I very much agree with that. Actually, I do still have several questions for our speakers, but we also have two, I think, very relevant, not very easy, but good questions in the Q&A. So I would like to read those out now and then pass them on to whichever speaker would like to respond. First of all, we have a question about the involvement at the current moment with Russian universities. So the question is, what about European universities who don't allow student mobility with Russian universities? The person asking the question says that they don't see the freedom here, and even less integrity, academic integrity. So how do you kind of balance these sorts of, competing values, I suppose, because the decision not to allow mobility may also have been taken with a kind of value judgment in mind. So I wondered whether maybe Liviu or Tomasz could comment on this.
I'm happy to start unless maybe Tomasz is more ready than I am. Okay, I don't hear Tomasz, so I can start. So the Russia case, which is Ukraine case, and Russia-Belarus case, is a test for how well the EHEA fundamental values are conceptualized, and also for their practical values. Are they well enough defined so that it helps us to deal with this matter? So I would say the way the statements on the fundamental values are drafted, this is not a matter of integrity. Integrity has to do fundamentally in the EHEA context as defined now with academic standards, right? Is this a matter of academic freedom? Probably yes, because academic freedom is defined as the freedom to teach, the freedom to learn, the freedom to do research, the freedom to communicate on academic matters without fear of reprisal. And yes, there is an element of reprisal here. So if I individually or my university cooperates with Russian academics, then there is a risk in several countries. So I think this is one approach. Now there are colleagues, and I am at the conference where we discussed fundamental values today. There are colleagues who say there should be no cooperation with Russia, for example, because they don't have academic freedom and integrity. That is a corrupt regime. University leader, rector signed that infamous statement supporting the invasion of Ukraine. There should be no cooperation with that. So, and they say this in the name of the fundamental values, right? And it's not just in the name of public responsibility of higher education. But my take on this is that I think the statements, the conceptualization of the EHEA values is quite good, and there is a difference between having them and then respecting them and using them. But I would say yes, a blanket interdiction of cooperation with Russian academics and students, and I'm not talking about cooperation with universities or with the government, is a limitation of academic freedom.
Indeed, because of course, working across borders and collaborating can also be seen as a fundamental academic value. Thank you, Liviu. I think the next question, I would maybe throw it directly to Tomasz, if that's okay, because he's actually mentioned in it. So the question is, freedom of HEIs from political interference is very important, as we just heard from you, Tomasz, but how to deal with the growing number of HEIs that follow a not fully academically independent agenda? So political pressures, but also funding pressures, business interests. It's an excellent question and not an easy one.
Not an easy one, and I guess that the problem, quite rightly pointed out in this question, is not very distant from the previous one, because what links both of them is the obvious or trivial consequence of respecting a plurality of values, that in many situations they come into conflict, and the solutions require certain trade-offs and balancing between them, taking into account various circumstances, considerations, policies, goals, and conditions, let's say, of particular institutions. And there might be no right answers in each such dilemma. What I mean is that depending on the detailed situation of a place and time, perhaps some different trade-offs is optimal, and there is no single unified solution that could best fit, let's say, one size of that answer that could fit all institutions everywhere in Europe and every time. And an example of that could be just the question how to deal with the Russian universities or Belarusian universities or researchers or students or PhD candidates from those universities. But also there are many more dilemmas and conflicts like that. And my answer would be that it's certainly better to be fully aware, or even I would say painfully aware of the genuine conflicts that they entail between values. With each of them we want to respect and try to realize as much as possible, taking into account the competing values at the same time, rather than pretending that there are best solutions that are just obvious and waiting until we discover them, and they have no costs and no disadvantages or downsides, taking into account our ability to remain faithful to all values at the same time. So in practical terms, we believe at our university, at least, we believe that the decision making in such situation should be organized more or less in the way in which we would like the democratic, pluralistic society to be organized. So to decide about those trade-offs by means of as participatory, as inclusive, as open and rational, thorough discussion as possible. And we practice something like that in case of this Russian problem. Let me call it this way. And it was not a decision of a rector or a council or something like that. We consulted as many bodies and members of our community as possible, and the variety of arguments, reasons, and points of view that have been articulated during that discussion was a value in itself, I would say. So we were able to illuminate the problem from every possible angle, and to build a kind of a robust legitimacy of the answer by letting everybody see that we want to listen to everybody who is interested and feels like having something to say about that, and trying to balance all those relevant considerations. So finally, we struck a kind of a compromise that we suspend the interinstitutional collaboration immediately after the invasion. But individual projects or corporations, in particular those in progress, can continue, let's say, and we don't expect, let's say, researchers to stop immediately in every case. So this is my answer as general, let's say, as possible.
Thank you. I think this is an approach that we saw a sort of compromise, I suppose, that we saw in many cases. I would not want to impose any longer on our participants' time, so I really would love to thank you, the three of you, for the discussion. It's been very, very interesting, very illuminating, and I think it's quite clear. Well, I just still had plenty of questions for you, which I didn't get to ask you. So I think it's clear that the conversation can continue and has to continue because it's an important issue. A final note, just to repeat again, that the next Bologna webinar is taking place on the 14th of May, and it will be dedicated to the social dimension of the Bologna process. So from my side, thank you to Liviu, thank you to Svein, and thank you for Thomas, and have a very good rest of the day. Thank you for joining us today.